Thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. I've never spoken at a Korean conference before, either a physical one or an online one, so I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I should perhaps say a few words about my university, the Kuhne Logistics University, which is based in Hamburg in Germany. It's a private university, it's 11 years old, and it actually has a centre which specialises in research into maritime transport. What I'm going to be doing in the next 20 minutes or so is giving a personal view on what I think are the main challenges in trying to decarbonise international shipping. This is a huge subject that I'm going to be trying to summarise in a very short time.
We've had a brutal reminder in recent months of why we must cut carbon emissions deeply and rapidly. We've seen extreme weather events in North America causing wildfires, and also in Greece we've seen severe flooding, for example, in Germany. We've also had the publication of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's sixth assessment report, which, as the media has reported, is the starkest warning yet of the challenges we face in dealing with climate change. So what does this mean for the shipping sector? Well, it's estimated that shipping operations worldwide account for just under 2.9% of greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't seem a very large percentage, but that percentage will be increasing because other sectors will be decarbonising more rapidly than shipping. Shipping is, by common consent, regarded as a hard-to-abate sector for two reasons. Partly because of the difficulty in reducing the carbon intensity of shipping, expressed as greenhouse gas emissions per tonne kilometre, but also because of the very high forecast growth rate for shipping. The International Transport Forum, in a report published earlier this year, reviewed a number of policy scenarios for decarbonising transport, and even in its most optimistic, most carbon-friendly scenario, what it called the Reshape Plus scenario, the amount of freight moved by sea would still double between 2020 and 2050. What that would do is increasing the shipping share of all freight movement worldwide from about 65% up to 70%. But despite this, the International Maritime Organization has set ambitious targets for decarbonising shipping. They want to see the carbon intensity of shipping operations reduced by 40% by 2030 and by 70% by 2050. Overall, they want to see total greenhouse gas emissions from shipping cut in half between 2008 and 2050, and it wants to see them phased out completely as soon as possible in this century.
So how do we decarbonise shipping operations? Well, in much of the research done on the decarbonisation of freight transport, the various options are classified into 5 categories. And the question is, how applicable are they to international shipping? So the first set of initiatives would restrain the future growth in demand for shipping. The second would shift freight to lower carbon transport modes. But I would argue that doesn't really apply in this case, because shipping is already the mode with the lowest carbon intensity. This option really applies more to shifting freight from road to rail, so I don't think we need to spend too much time really discussing this set of options for shipping. The third category of measures would improve the loading of vessels, using up surplus capacity and consolidating loads on board ships. The fourth would improve the energy efficiency of shipping operations, reducing fuel consumption per nautical mile or per hour spent in a port, for example. And then the fifth category of measure would essentially defossilise the energy we use in the shipping sector, switching from heavy fuel oil and marine diesel fuel to low carbon renewable energy sources. So how might we reduce the future demand for international shipping? Well, one thing that will help is the phasing out of fossil fuels during this century, because a lot of coal, oil and gas is currently moved by sea. is estimated in 2017 that about 40% of marine trade is fossil fuels. But we have to recognise that in the meantime we have to put in place a renewable energy infrastructure. And so there's significant movement of wind turbines and solar panels and related biomass, and that will partly offset the reduction in fossil fuel traffic. There has been much discussion in recent months about companies attaching greater importance to supply chain resilience as a result of their experience during the pandemic. And this may result in greater localisation of production and sourcing. There have been various surveys suggested that many companies are now considering reshoring their operations to Europe or to North America. Personally, I think that this will not reverse globalisation. It may affect globalisation at the margins, but I don't honestly think this is going to have a major effect in reducing future global transport. If we were to dampen demand for international trade, that would weaken the economic development prospects of lower income countries and would therefore conflict with global economic development objectives. It wouldn't just affect the economic performance of poorer countries. According to OECD research, many wealthier OECD countries would also see a contraction in their economies if governments were to introduce protectionist policies designed to encourage reshoring. And it wouldn't just carry an economic penalty. There would also be an environmental penalty in moving back to more localised production and sourcing, because much international trade actually yields a net reduction in carbon emissions. Where the production-related emissions in the exporting country are lower than those in the importing country. Because if you conduct a full life cycle analysis of the product, what you discover is that the carbon footprint of imported products is often lower. But there's no denying that there is a carbon penalty associated with international trade. But according to research, for example, in a seminal paper by Shapiro published in 2016, shows that the economic benefits of international trade exceed the monetary value of CO2, even if you set quite a high price on each tonne of carbon emitted. So that on balance, it can still be desirable for us to have large amounts of international freight traffic, and much of that, of course, would be transported by sea. We also have to ask what the mechanisms would be that would attempt to reduce the future volume of international trade and shipping. These presumably would be market-based measures involving the imposition of carbon taxes or carbon prices. But research reviewed by the World Bank, for example, suggests that the volume of international trade would be relatively insensitive to the imposition of carbon prices in the maritime sector. And a more recent study done by UNCTAD has looked at the sensitivity of international trade volumes to a broader range of maritime decarbonisation measures, not simply freight rates, but also the effect, for example, of increasing transit times. And they look, for example, at the IMO's high greenhouse gas reduction scenario, and even that, they reckon, would only reduce the volume of international trade in the future by about half of 1%. So these mechanisms would not, therefore, have a dramatic effect on reducing trade levels. It's also worth pointing out that the increases in the cost of transport would be relatively small by comparison with what has happened in the maritime sector, particularly the container shipping sector, over the past year, where we've seen a huge inflation in freight rates on most of the main trade lanes. And that really puts into perspective what the effect of carbon pricing would be. So my overall conclusion is that this first category of decarbonisation initiatives really doesn't offer much scope for cutting emissions, unless, of course, we get into a real climate crisis when governments have to think about doing really draconian things to cut emissions. Maybe at that point, measures to reduce the future volume of freight and trade would then be implemented. The third category of initiative would improve the loading of ships, a subject which has unfortunately attracted relatively little research, and that makes it very difficult for us to quantify the potential carbon savings really from raising vessel load factors. There's a chronic lack of data. There are also differences in the way that shipping lines define utilisation or define the nominal capacity of their vessels. Another problem is that many of the utilisation metrics that are used by shipping lines, for example, don't necessarily correlate all that well with carbon intensity. There are also some issues which are quite peculiar really to the maritime sector. So in the shipping industry, one often has to add ballast water to the vessel to improve its stability and its trim. Again, there's nothing to compare with that in other freight transport modes. There are also very pronounced traffic imbalances on many of the main trade lanes, which involves long distance repositioning of empty containers and vessels. So there is a lot of structural empty running, if you like, in the maritime sector, which would be very hard to reduce, let alone eliminate. We also have to recognise that there has been chronic overcapacity in some sectors of the international shipping business, particularly in container shipping. It is just very difficult to match supply and demand in this sector, particularly when you're dealing with trade fluctuations. There's also, of course, been a surge in the available capacity in megaships in recent years, and again, that has created excess capacity. But, we're in a rather unusual situation at the moment, in that, particularly in the container shipping sector, we're working at near full capacity. Indeed, there are capacity shortages on many trade lanes as a result of the pandemic and the way in which business is recovering from that. But I see this as a temporary situation. The question is, in the longer term, what will happen to the average capacity utilisation of ships? We also have to consider the impact of market restructuring. What will be the longer term effects of things like the formation of alliances in the container shipping sector, and also digitalisation of freight forwarding. In the road freight sector, the expectation is that digitalisation will help to reduce empty running and improve average vehicle load factors. And the hope is, of course, that digitalisation will have a similar effect on the shipping sector, and that will then translate into a lower carbon intensity. The fourth category of initiative will improve the energy efficiency of shipping operations. There's both a technical and an operational dimension to this. On the technological side, a lot of creative thinking has gone into redesigning future vessels, altering their hull, their engine and so forth to cut energy consumption. We've also had since 2013 a fuel economy standard in the maritime sector, with the IMO's Energy Efficiency Design Index, increasing the fuel efficiency of new vessels. But that's a longer term development, because in this sector we're dealing with long life assets. I mean, the average ship was over 20 years old last year. Now, of course, we can retrofit fuel saving devices to existing vessels. We also have the IMO's new EEXI, the Energy Efficiency Standard for existing vehicles, which will take effect from 2023, and will give companies an added incentive to retrofit existing vessels. It will also encourage them to apply more effectively a whole range of operational improvements to the way the vessels are managed, adopting things like weather routing, cleaning the hull and propeller more effectively, improving the trim of the vessel, and upgrading the maintenance and optimizing the speed with which the vessels sail. All of these things have been key elements in SEAMP. Again, the IMO's Shipping Energy Efficiency Management Plan, which plans which many companies, many shipping lines have been adopting in recent years. That is now being enhanced. It's been operating on a voluntary basis up until now. It's now going to become mandatory. And all of this has been done really to reduce the carbon intensity, improve the energy efficiency and reduce the carbon intensity of shipping. Now that carbon intensity has been improving. So according to a recent study by the International Council for Clean Transportation, we've seen about a 22% reduction in the carbon intensity of shipping from 2008 to 2018. But we now have to see a similar rate of reduction to 2030 to achieve the IMO's 2030 target. Now, just to these things, of course, this will be encouraged by the application of EXXI and SEAMP. But it's worth looking at one of the developments which has helped to reduce the carbon intensity of shipping over the past decade or so, and that is slow steaming. Because there's a quadratic relationship between the vessel speed and the amount of energy it consumes. A 10% reduction in vessel speed will cut about fuel consumption by about 23%. But it's worth noting that recently the average speed of vessels has been increasing again, partly as a result of the trend I mentioned earlier, the fact that certainly the container shipping sector is working very close to full capacity. It's been quite natural, I think, for shipping lines to accelerate their vessels to gain extra capacity. It's estimated that between June last year and April this year, there was about a 5.5% increase in the average speed of container ships, and that will have increased their carbon intensity. So the question is this a short-term development or a longer-term change? And the hope is, of course, this is a temporary development and that the average speed will again reduce to yield some carbon savings. The fifth and final category of initiative will move us from fossil fuel to low carbon renewable energy in the maritime sector. In its fourth greenhouse gas study published last year, the IMO reckons that about 2/3 of the savings in CO2 emissions from the sector by 2050 will come from the use of alternative fuel. So what are these alternative energy sources? Well, unlike the road and rail freight sectors, I don't think shipping will have much direct access to low carbon electricity. If we did it by batteries, the batteries would be too big and too heavy, and there's no way we can suspend cables across the oceans. But that's not to say that there will be some direct access of low carbon electricity. Certainly in domestic shipping, in China, for example, there are examples of cargo vessels which are battery powered and can carry loads of up to 2,000 tons. We also have cold ironing, because when the vessels are moored in the port, they can get access to shoreside electricity. Worth noting too that research some years ago suggested that in the case of Asian and European ports, about 58% of the CO2 emissions were coming from the ships rather than from the port, and so this would be quite an effective way of decarbonising their operations while in port. If one looks at other alternative energy sources, one is biofuels, which can come in the form of biodiesel or bio-LNG or biomethanol. Biodiesel, for example, has been successfully trialled, both as a sole fuel and also blended with marine diesel. But the question is one of scalability. Would we ever be able to produce enough biodiesel in a sustainable way? Because the worry is if you then cultivate biocrops to produce that biofuel, that on a life cycle basis, that can actually emit more greenhouse gas than the fossil fuel that it is replacing. And there's also a question about how much land we would require to grow the necessary biocrops. There was a study done in the UK in 2012 which suggested that if at that stage you had wanted to replace all ship bunker fuel with biodiesel, you would need land equivalent to 2 United Kingdoms really to provide the necessary fuel. It seems that the two main contenders currently for the future role of low carbon energy source for the shipping sector are e-methanol and green ammonia, both of which will require the indirect use of low carbon electricity in their production, particularly in the electrolysis of green hydrogen, which is a key ingredient in both cases. Worth noting that Maersk is planning to operate the world's first carbon neutral container ship in 2023, and they're suggesting that e-methanol may be used for that purpose. And we also have examples of ships powered by ammonia, admittedly not green ammonia at this stage. Now, I don't have time in this very short presentation to weigh up the strengths and weaknesses of these alternative low-carbon energy sources. They obviously need to be compared against a whole range of criteria, like their energy density, the pressure and temperature of the storage and distribution they require, the vessel conversion cost, port bunkering capacity, and questions about their future availability and cost. There are many studies, I think, are now comparing these different forms of energy. I think they could well coexist, and they could be catering, if you like, for the needs of different sectors of the shipping market. But one important part I will emphasise is just how big the transformation will have to be to the global marine energy supply system for us to replace HFO and marine diesel fuel with these alternatives. It's going to be hugely expensive, and that will be reflected in the future cost of these low carbon fuels. The IMO's fourth greenhouse gas study actually estimated the future cost in 2050 of these fuels, and as you can see, they're substantially more expensive than the current very low sulfur fuel oil that vessels are using. That higher cost, I think, will probably delay the transition to these fuels. Because it will be reflected in the future cost of shipping, it may also have the effect of dampening future demand for shipping, which gets us back to the first category of initiative. We mustn't overlook the future contribution of the wind to the decarbonisation of shipping. What people are referring to as wind-assisted shipping propulsion, or WASP for short, the subject of an interesting journal paper published by some of my KLU colleagues recently. You can see the link on the slide. Using either sails or Flettner rotors, for example, to get some additional power assistance from the wind. A recent study done in the UK suggested that by 2050, between 40 and 45% of ships may be making use of wind propulsion, and they reckon that could contribute up to about 20% of the energy that they use. So to bring this presentation to a conclusion, I think I have to say that I see the main drivers of maritime decarbonisation being the energy-related options I've just spoken about in categories 4 and 5, improving energy efficiency and switching to these low-carbon forms of energy. I would commend to you a paper published in 2017 by Bowman and others, which reviewed 150 studies of shipping decarbonisation and focused on 22 energy-related decarbonisation measures. And I think this was a very helpful assessment of the contribution that they could all make. So thank you for your attention. I hope that you found this presentation of interest. I'd like to draw your attention to a book I published in 2018 on the decarbonisation of logistics, which discusses the decarbonisation of shipping, but puts that in a broader logistical context. You'll also see my contact details on this slide, and if you have any queries about what I've just been talking about, then by all means drop me an email. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the event.